Thick dark pus was seeping through the king's bandages, soaking into the fabric, and the courtiers, keeping their faces calm, could feel the monarch standing beside them struggling not to collapse from the pain in his anus. This man was Louis XIV, master of Versailles and of Europe, whose power rested on an unbroken display of strength, and whose body was considered inseparable from the state itself. And this is no fiction, but the hidden side of real chronicles, where the official legend of the invincible Sun King covered up the decay that threatened the fate of France. Now you will hear a story they tried to hide behind the golden walls of the palace, because not everyone can bear to see how a single inflamed area of flesh turns into a threat to an entire empire. If you continue watching, you will see how the human body can destroy even absolute power. Louis XIV had ruled France for over 2 decades with an iron grip that transformed absolute monarchy into something almost mythical. He didn't govern through ministers or councils who made decisions on his behalf. He controlled everything personally, from military campaigns to diplomatic negotiations to the arts and architecture that defined French culture. When he said, "I am the state," he meant it literally. His body and the French nation had become conceptually fused together in a way that made his personal health inseparable from national security. He had built the Palace of Versailles and moved the entire French government there, creating a world where thousands of nobles lived under his direct supervision, where even getting dressed in the morning became a public ceremony that demonstrated his divine authority. Every gesture, every word, every public appearance was choreographed to remind everyone that he was chosen by God to rule. By 1686, France had become the dominant power in Europe because of Louis's brilliant political maneuvering, and other kings across the continent tried desperately to copy his style of governance. But that summer, something started happening to the king's body that threatened everything he'd built. It began as a small tender spot near his anus, the kind of minor irritation anyone might experience and dismiss as temporary. Louis felt it first in early June, a slight soreness when he sat down that made him shift his position during council meetings. He assumed it would disappear within a few days. Kings might rule by divine right, but they still had bodies that developed random discomforts. There was no reason to give it serious attention. Except the soreness didn't fade. It grew more pronounced over the following weeks, transforming from vague discomfort into actual pain that he couldn't dismiss or ignore. The area felt inflamed and hot to the touch. When he lowered himself into a chair, pressure on the spot sent sharp sensations through his lower body that made him catch his breath and force his face into a calm expression that cost him everything to maintain. His personal servants were the first to see physical evidence of what was happening. When they helped him dress each morning, they noticed spots of discharge on his undergarments, clear fluid at first that soaked through the fabric and left stains. The servants said nothing, because commenting on the king's body was absolutely forbidden. Louis himself tried applying various remedies quietly, having his doctors prepare ointments that could be used in privacy, but nothing made any difference. The tender spot opened into a small wound that wept constantly, and over the next several weeks that wound grew deeper and more painful. What Louis didn't understand yet was that this wasn't a simple sore that would heal. This was an anal fistula forming in his body, a tunnel of infection burrowing from the surface of his skin inward through muscle and tissue toward his rectum, creating a channel that would fill with bacteria and pus and cause agony that would only get worse. The discharge changed as the fistula developed, transforming from clear fluid to yellowish pus that had a distinctive smell, thick and sweet and impossible to ignore. The king's servants began changing his bandages multiple times throughout the day, carefully collecting the soiled cloths and burning them immediately to destroy evidence of his condition. They understood without being told that what they were witnessing was information that could destabilize France if it leaked beyond the palace. Spain wanted to reclaim territories France had conquered. England resented French dominance. The German princes chafed under French influence. Every rival nation maintained spies at Versailles, people who attended court specifically to observe Louis and gather intelligence. If word spread that the king was suffering from an infection in such an embarrassing location, that he might be dying from a wound near his anus, it would be interpreted as weakness and opportunity by every enemy France had made during Louis's aggressive expansion of French power. By late summer, the pain had become severe enough that Louis could no longer sit through council meetings without obvious distress. The infected tunnel had grown several inches long, burrowing through layers of muscle tissue. Every time his bowels moved, bacteria entered the tunnel and made the infection worse, creating a cycle where healing became impossible. The tissue lining the fistula was dying, producing copious pus that had to drain constantly. Louis felt throbbing pain every moment of every day, a deep burning that intensified whenever he moved. Sitting down had transformed from a basic function into an ordeal that required him to grip chair arms and force every facial muscle to remain calm while agony shot through his body. His chief physician Antoine Daquin examined him in absolute secrecy behind locked doors with guards posted outside. What Daquin found alarmed him deeply. The fistula had created a channel several inches deep, with secondary inflammation in surrounding tissue. This wasn't something that would heal with rest. This was deteriorating rapidly, and Daquin knew anal fistulas killed people regularly in the 17th century. Louis made a decision that revealed everything about how he understood power. He would continue his normal schedule as if nothing was wrong. He would attend every council meeting, every diplomatic audience, every public ceremony his role demanded. He would maintain the elaborate daily rituals that demonstrated his special status. And he would hide his condition so completely that no one outside his immediate circle would suspect anything was wrong. This wasn't bravery in any conventional sense. This was a calculated political decision based on the reality that his entire system of government depended on him appearing strong and healthy. The moment he admitted weakness, the moment he canceled appearances or failed to show up for functions, rumors would spread and France's enemies would begin circling like wolves who'd caught the scent of blood. So the performance began. Louis stopped sitting whenever he could avoid it. During council meetings, he would stand near the table, leaning against it as though he simply preferred conducting business that way. He positioned himself near walls so he could rest one hand against them for support while making it look casual. Sometimes he would press his other hand against his lower back, creating the appearance of a relaxed pose when actually he was trying to ease constant throbbing pain. When he absolutely had to sit, during formal ceremonies where standing would have been too obviously strange, he would lower himself into the chair as slowly as possible, trying to distribute his weight to minimize agony, then sit perfectly still to avoid movement that might make things worse. His face remained calm and majestic throughout these ordeals, betraying nothing of the effort it cost to maintain that expression. The courtiers noticed the changes. These were people who had spent years at Versailles learning to interpret every subtle shift in the king's behavior. They saw that he stood more than he used to. They observed how carefully he moved, how he would pause before lowering himself into a chair as though preparing for something unpleasant. They caught occasional grimaces that crossed his face when he thought nobody was watching. And they definitely detected the smell, that faint but unmistakable odor of infection that clung to him despite heavy perfumes. But none of them said anything. Acknowledging the king's apparent illness would have been the same as suggesting he was unfit to rule, and that kind of suggestion could destroy a courtier's entire position. Louis had absolute power over their lives and fortunes. Men who displeased him found themselves stripped of titles and income, forced to leave the palace. So the nobles pretended not to notice. They continued conversations as if everything was normal, carefully averting their eyes at precisely the right moments. The conspiracy of silence extended through every level of the palace, creating a strange atmosphere where everyone knew something was wrong but nobody could speak about it directly. Servants who saw the wound when they changed bandages understood they were looking at something that could never be mentioned. They watched discharge soak through cloth within hours, requiring fresh dressings 3 or 4 times daily. They smelled the infection growing stronger. They saw Louis grip furniture for support when he thought he was alone, saw his breathing become shallow when pain spiked through his body. But they burned the soiled bandages immediately and never spoke a word, because the king's body had become a state secret more closely guarded than military plans. The doctors were running out of options by early autumn. They had tried everything 17th century medicine knew. They made poultices from herbs and minerals, substances that traditional theory claimed would draw out infection. They applied these directly to the wound multiple times daily, but the fistula kept producing more pus. They bled Louis regularly from arm veins, following ancient belief that disease came from imbalanced bodily humors. They prescribed special diets based on theories about hot and cold properties. Nothing worked. The infected tunnel continued growing deeper, continued filling with bacteria and dead tissue, continued causing pain that was becoming unbearable. Daquin finally had to confront reality. Conservative treatment wasn't going to save the king's life. The fistula was too deep, too well established in tissue that couldn't heal while remaining infected. Every day increased the danger that infection would spread into Louis's bloodstream, which would mean death within days. The only option left was surgery, and that prospect terrified everyone involved. Operating on an anal fistula meant cutting deep into one of the most sensitive, nerve-filled areas of the human body. It meant creating a large open wound in a location constantly exposed to bacteria from the patient's own waste. It meant hoping desperately that the patient survived both immediate trauma and the infection that almost inevitably followed. There was no anesthesia in 1686. There was no understanding of germs or sterilization. The surgeon would operate with instruments that had been cleaned but not sterilized, cutting into already infected tissue, and the patient would be fully conscious throughout with nothing to manage pain except perhaps wine or opium. The mortality rate for this surgery was horrifying. Most patients who underwent fistula operations died within days or weeks, killed by blood loss during the procedure, by overwhelming infection afterward, or simply by shock and trauma of having flesh cut open without real pain control. The surgeons who performed these operations weren't respected physicians who treated nobility. They were craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeship, men who occupied much lower social status and were often viewed with suspicion. For a surgeon to operate on the King of France was almost unprecedented. If the operation succeeded, the surgeon would be celebrated and rewarded beyond imagination. If it failed, if Louis died on the table or from complications, the surgeon would be held responsible for killing the monarch, which meant torture and execution for him, probably punishment for his family as well. Daquin brought in a surgeon named Charles-François Félix to examine the king and provide expert assessment. Félix was considered one of the best surgeons in Paris, a man who had performed countless operations, but even he had never successfully treated an anal fistula as severe as Louis's. He examined the king in complete privacy, carefully probing the wound to understand its depth and extent. What he found was worse than anyone hoped. The fistula had created a primary tunnel several inches long, extending from the surface near Louis's anus deep through muscle tissue toward the rectal wall. But there were also signs of secondary inflammation, areas where infection was spreading into adjacent tissue and creating new pockets where pus could accumulate. The entire region was inflamed and full of dying flesh that would need to be removed if there was any hope of healing. Félix explained everything to Louis directly, holding nothing back about the risks. Surgery would require cutting through all infected tissue, opening the fistula completely to allow drainage, removing dead flesh, then hoping the resulting wound would heal from bottom up over weeks or months. Louis asked the only question that really mattered. What were his chances of survival if they did the operation? Félix was honest. He didn't know. Nobody knew, because this particular surgery had such poor track record that most people with severe fistulas simply died without anyone attempting to operate. But Louis's chances without surgery were zero. The infection would continue spreading until it reached his bloodstream, and then he would die screaming as his body shut down. At least surgery offered some possibility of success, however slim. Louis made his decision quickly, the way he made all decisions. They would do the surgery. But Félix made a strange request. He wanted time to prepare, not just mentally but practically. He wanted to practice the operation before performing it on the king, which meant finding other patients with anal fistulas and operating on them to refine his technique and understand exactly what he would encounter when he cut into Louis's body. The French court agreed immediately, because they understood what Félix was really saying. He needed to figure out how to perform this surgery successfully before trying it on the king, because there wouldn't be any second chances. Félix spent the next several months quietly seeking out patients with fistulas. Poor people who couldn't afford regular medical care, prisoners who were offered surgery in exchange for other considerations, anyone who had a condition similar to the king's and was willing to let a royal surgeon experiment on them. He operated on these practice patients repeatedly throughout the fall of 1686, learning from each procedure, adjusting his technique, discovering what worked and what didn't. Some of these people died on his operating table or shortly afterward from infection. Others survived but experienced complications that taught Felix what to avoid. He took careful notes on everything, building up both technical knowledge and confidence. Meanwhile, he was also designing new surgical instruments specifically for operating on the king. The standard tools available weren't adequate for what needed to be done. Felix needed something that could cut deep into infected tissue in a controlled way, something curved to follow the shape of the fistula tunnel, something sharp enough to slice through tough fibrous tissue but precise enough not to damage vital structures nearby. He worked with instrument makers to create a new kind of blade, practicing with it on his experimental patients until he felt confident he could use it effectively when stakes were literally life and death. By November, Felix had operated on somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen practice patients, and he'd learned everything he could learn without actually cutting into the King of France. It was time to face the task that would either make him famous or get him executed. The decision to proceed had to be kept absolutely secret from everyone except a tiny circle who needed to know. No announcement was made to the French public. No foreign ambassadors were informed. The only people who knew were Louis's closest ministers, his personal physicians, a handful of trusted servants, and Felix himself. The date was set for November 18th. Felix had designed his new surgical instrument, a curved blade that could reach deep into the fistula tract and cut through infected channel in a single motion. He had practiced using it enough to feel confident, or at least as confident as anyone could feel before attempting surgery that would probably kill the most powerful man in Europe. On the morning of November 18th, Louis woke knowing this might be his last day alive. He had seen enough battlefield injuries and enough failed surgeries to understand exactly what was about to happen. Someone was going to cut deep into one of the most sensitive areas of his body, slice through infected tissue, and hope he didn't bleed to death or develop the kind of massive infection that killed people in days. There was no way to numb the pain. There was no way to prevent infection. There was only Felix's skill and Louis's ability to endure what was coming. The king positioned himself on his bed, lying on his side with his back to Felix and his legs drawn up to expose the surgical site. His personal servants held him in place, because even the strongest, most disciplined man would instinctively try to pull away when someone started cutting into him. Felix took his new instrument, the curved blade he designed and practiced with, and made his first incision into the king's flesh. He had to cut deep enough to fully open the fistula tract, to expose the infected channel so he could drain all the pus and remove diseased tissue. The blade went in, slicing through skin and muscle and the tunnel of infection that had been growing for months. Blood and pus poured out immediately, thick dark fluid that represented months of accumulated infection finally being released from the king's body. Louis screamed. Multiple accounts confirmed the king cried out in pain during the surgery. This wasn't a brief operation. Felix had to make multiple cuts, working carefully to remove all infected tissue while trying not to damage the anal sphincter or other vital structures. Every cut caused fresh agony. Every time Felix's instrument scraped against bone or nerve-dense tissue, Louis experienced pain beyond what most people can imagine. The surgery lasted much longer than anyone wanted, because Felix refused to rush. He knew this was his only chance. If he left infected tissue behind, if he didn't open the wound completely, if he made any significant mistake, the king would develop blood poisoning within days and die screaming. When Felix finally finished cutting, the surgical site was a massive open wound. He packed it with cloth soaked in various solutions meant to prevent infection, nothing that would actually kill bacteria since nobody understood bacteria existed yet, but substances that had been observed to help wounds heal. The packing hurt almost as much as the cutting had, because now Louis had raw exposed tissue being pressed and filled with material. Felix bandaged everything as securely as possible and stepped back to wait. The surgery was done. Now came the truly dangerous part, the days and weeks of recovery when infection could still develop and kill the king despite all their efforts. The first few days after surgery were absolutely critical. Felix watched Louis constantly, checking for any sign of overwhelming infection that typically killed surgery patients in this era. Fever could appear suddenly. The wound could start producing pus that smelled different from pre-surgery discharge, a sweet rotten smell indicating infection was spreading into surrounding tissue. The king could become delirious, lose consciousness, develop rapid heartbeat and cold extremities that meant his body was shutting down. Any of these symptoms would mean death was imminent and nothing could be done to stop it. But none of those symptoms appeared. Louis developed some fever in the days immediately following surgery, which was expected given the trauma his body had experienced. But the fever remained manageable. The wound produced discharge as it began to heal, but the discharge looked normal, not the distinctively foul-smelling pus that indicated spreading infection. Felix changed the packing regularly, removing the soiled material and replacing it with fresh cloth, a process that caused Louis fresh pain each time but was absolutely necessary to keep the wound draining properly. The king endured these daily torments with remarkable stoicism, or at least with the appearance of stoicism that his role demanded. He couldn't show weakness even now, even in the privacy of his own chambers with only his doctors and closest servants present. Within a week, it became clear that Louis was going to survive. The wound was healing, slowly and painfully, but healing nonetheless. The infection that had threatened to kill him was finally being defeated, drained away and removed piece by piece as dead tissue was cut out and the remaining flesh began to regenerate. The success of the operation transformed everything. What had been an intimate medical catastrophe threatening to destroy the French monarchy became instead a political triumph. Louis had faced down death itself and emerged victorious. The surgery that could have killed him had instead saved him, and more importantly, it had demonstrated that even the most dangerous medical conditions could be treated successfully with sufficient skill and courage. Word of the king's successful operation began to spread, carefully at first and then more widely, and the reaction across Europe was extraordinary. The surgery became fashionable. Aristocrats who had minor discomforts or imagined they might have conditions similar to the king's began demanding similar operations. Felix became a celebrity surgeon, elevated to a position of respect and wealth that no surgeon had ever achieved before. He had operated on the King of France and saved his life, transforming himself from a craftsman into a hero. The broader impact was even more significant. Louis's successful surgery changed how people thought about medical treatment and the relationship between monarchy and mortality. The Sun King had survived something that should have killed him, not through divine intervention but through human skill and surgical innovation. Felix's new instrument and his technique of completely opening the fistula tract became the standard treatment for this condition. Other surgeons studied his methods and improved upon them. The operation that had been considered almost impossibly dangerous became routine, saving thousands of lives over the following decades. And France itself benefited from the entire episode. The king who had hidden his wound for months, who had maintained the appearance of divine strength while suffering privately, had emerged from the ordeal even more powerful than before. He had proven that nothing could destroy him, not disease, not pain, not even the most dangerous surgery of the age. The Sun King's hidden wound had become a legend of triumph over mortality itself, and Europe would remember it for generations.